50 miles. That's all that separates the Atlantic Ocean from the Pacific. 50 miles of jungle and mountain and disease, and the continental divide rising 300 feet out of the ground like a wall that two oceans had been building for 3 million years. 50 miles that added 14,000 miles to every sea voyage between the coasts of America. 50 miles that wrecked ships, killed sailors, and made the movement of global trade slow and expensive and brutal in ways that reshaped the history of every nation that depended on the sea. The United States moved that wall in 10 years, excavated 232 million cubic yards of rock and clay and volcanic mud, detonated 61 million pounds of dynamite, more explosive per day at peak construction than any military operation in American history at that point, ran 100 steam shovels simultaneously in a gorge 300 feet deep and 9 miles long, 24 hours a day, in a jungle that got 300 inches of rain a year and killed you with the air if you let it. And when it was done, the shipping route from New York to San Francisco shrank from 14,000 miles to 6,000. Everything changed. Global trade changed, naval warfare changed, the map changed. Here is what the official account doesn't linger on. 5,609 men died during the American construction phase. Official number comes from hospital records and vital statistics that the Canal Zone kept for some workers. The real number is higher, and we'll get to exactly why. Add the French, who spent 23 years trying and failing before America bought the wreckage and started over, and the estimate climbs past 20,000. Some historians say 27,000. The true count is impossible to establish because nobody kept careful records for the workers who mattered least and died most. Before we're done, you'll understand exactly how they dug 50 miles through a mountain in a jungle. You'll understand the disease that had to be conquered before a single steam shovel fired up. And you'll understand why the 20,000 West Indian workers who did the hardest labour for the worst pay in the worst conditions don't have a single monument in the Canal Zone with their names on it. We're going to find out who built the Panama Canal. And we're going to count exactly what it cost them to do it. Start with geography, because nothing about this story makes sense without it. The Isthmus of Panama is 50 miles wide at its narrowest. On one side, the Caribbean Sea, connected to the Atlantic. On the other, the Pacific. For a ship sailing from New York to San Francisco, or from London to Shanghai, or from Buenos Aires to Tokyo, those 50 miles represent a wall. Go around it and you travel 14,000 additional miles around Cape Horn, through some of the most violent water on Earth, past the bottom of South America, where the Atlantic and Pacific collide in gale-force winds and 60-foot swells and ice that appears without warning out of fog. Cape Horn killed sailors for 300 years. Ships went down by the hundreds in those waters. Crews were lost. Cargoes were lost. The passage around the Horn took weeks in good conditions and months when the weather turned, which it did constantly, because the weather at Cape Horn is almost never good. Every nation with a navy and every company with a fleet understood the Panama problem. If you could cut through those 50 miles, you would rewrite the economics of global trade. As early as 1534, the King of Spain ordered a survey of a possible canal route. Nothing came of it. The technology didn't exist. 200 years passed. The technology still didn't exist. 300 years. The problem was still the same. By the 1840s, the California gold rush made it acute. Gold was coming out of the Sierra Nevada. It needed to reach New York. People needed to reach California. The sea route around the Horn took 5 months, through Panama by ship to Colon, then by mule across 50 miles of jungle trail to Panama City, then by ship again to San Francisco. 3 weeks, if you were lucky, if you didn't get cholera on the trail, if the mules didn't fail, if the ships connected. The Panama Railroad, completed in 1855, cut the overland crossing to hours. But you still needed 2 ships. You still needed to transfer everything at both ends. Someone had to build the canal. The question was who and what it would cost them. His name was Ferdinand de Lesseps, and he had already moved the world once. In 1869, while the Central Pacific and Union Pacific were driving the Golden Spike at Promontory Summit, de Lesseps opened the Suez Canal. 100 miles of waterway through the Egyptian desert, connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, eliminating 6,000 miles from the Europe to Asia route. It had taken 10 years and the labour of 1.5 million workers, many of them conscripted Egyptian peasants. It had cost 120 lives per mile, an average across the whole project. It had been called impossible until it wasn't. De Lesseps was not an engineer. He was a diplomat, a promoter, a man who could raise money and inspire confidence and convince investors that the impossible was merely expensive. The Suez Canal had worked because it was a flat cut through sand. Sea level on the Mediterranean equaled sea level on the Red Sea. Dig the ditch, fill it with water, ships cross. No locks, no elevation change, no geology more complicated than sand. He looked at Panama and saw the same problem. He was catastrophically wrong. In 1879, de Lesseps convened an international congress in Paris to debate canal design. Serious engineers argued for a lock canal, chambers that would raise and lower ships over the continental divide. De Lesseps wanted sea level. He'd done it at Suez. He would do it here. He was the most famous builder in the world. He overruled the engineers. Construction began in January 1881. Tens of thousands of workers, recruited from the Caribbean islands, from Europe, from across Central America, arrived at Colon on the Atlantic coast of Panama and found a jungle. 300 inches of rain per year. Temperatures that exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit every afternoon, with humidity so thick the air felt like wet cloth against your skin. Mud that sucked your boots off with every step. And something nobody had planned for at all. The mosquitoes. In 1881, the germ theory of disease was new and contested. The prevailing explanation for tropical illness was miasma, bad air from rotting vegetation. The jungle certainly had rotting vegetation. So when the workers got malaria, the doctors blamed the jungle air. When they got yellow fever, the doctors blamed the jungle air. They had no idea what was actually killing people. Yellow fever. Understand what yellow fever does. First, nothing. You feel fine for 3 to 6 days, then the fever comes. Then the muscle pain, the headache, the photosensitivity. In mild cases, you recover there. In severe cases, the fever drops briefly. A remission that looks like recovery lasts less than a day, and then comes back harder. The skin yellows as the liver fails. The kidneys begin to fail. Internal hemorrhaging starts. The final stage is called black vomit. Blood pooling in the stomach, expelled dark and thick. Time from first symptom to death. Sometimes 4 days. No warning. No reliable treatment. No way to know when you felt fine whether you were 4 days from dying. The French hospitals in Colon and Panama City were designed to help workers recover. They were incubating the disease instead. The nurses placed flower pots around the legs of hospital beds to keep the ants away from the patients. The flower pot sources held standing water. Standing water breeds Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. The hospitals were surrounded by mosquito nurseries, and nobody understood why the patients kept dying. In some months of the French construction, the weekly death rate was 20 men per 1,000 workers. In some months, more workers were arriving in coffins than with shovels. They dug for 8 years. They moved 70 million cubic yards of material. They spent $287 million, roughly a billion francs. They got 11 miles into the continental divide. In 1889, the money ran out and the company went bankrupt. The equipment rusted in the jungle. The cut filled with water. The jungle grew back over the equipment in months. At least 20,000 workers died during the French construction. Some died of yellow fever. More died of malaria. Some died in landslides and accidents. Some got sick, left Panama, died somewhere else. Those deaths were never recorded. The French company didn't track its workers carefully. Workers who were dying were expensive and inconvenient. Better to not look too closely at the numbers. De Lesseps was 84 years old when the company collapsed. He was tried for fraud in France. The Panama scandal, they called it. 800,000 French investors had been wiped out. He was convicted, sentenced to prison. He died in 1894 before he could be imprisoned. His sea-level canal went with him. Panama sat abandoned. The rusting equipment, the half-built houses, the cemeteries full of workers from a dozen countries. For 10 years, until America decided it was worth trying again. Theodore Roosevelt understood the Panama Canal as a military and economic necessity, and he was not interested in obstacles. In 1898, the USS Oregon, a battleship stationed in San Francisco, had been ordered to Cuba during the Spanish-American War. It sailed around Cape Horn. The journey took 68 days. By the time it arrived, the major naval engagement was over. Roosevelt, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, had watched that happen and made a decision. The United States needed a canal so that its navy could move between oceans in days instead of months. Panama was part of Colombia. Colombia's Senate rejected the Canal Treaty in 1903. 3 days later, Panama declared independence. The USS Nashville sat in Colen Harbor while the rebellion was happening, ensuring no Colombian troops crossed to suppress it. Roosevelt recognized the new Panamanian government within hours of the declaration. The Canal Treaty was signed 2 weeks later. The United States paid $10 million up front and $250,000 per year. Roosevelt paid Colombia $25 million in 1921, years after he'd left office, in what is diplomatically called a reparation. Less diplomatically, it was a settlement after a theft. America bought the French assets for $40 million and took control of the Canal Zone in 1904, 10 miles wide, 50 miles long, carved out of the middle of the newest country in the Western Hemisphere. They inherited rusting Couvreux steam shovels already half swallowed by vegetation, abandoned excavations slowly filling back in, a rail line that worked imperfectly, villages built for workers who had died, and the worst disease environment in the Western Hemisphere. The first American chief engineer was named John Wallace. He lasted 9 months, quit in June 1905, gave no satisfying explanation. People who were there said he had been terrified of yellow fever the entire time and had spent most of his tenure negotiating a raise rather than digging anything. He left behind a zone that had made no meaningful construction progress and a workforce that had no confidence in American management. Before another shovel hit the ground, someone had to solve the mosquito. William Crawford Gorgas had been in Cuba in 1900 when Walter Reed's team proved something that most of the medical world considered impossible. Yellow fever was not transmitted by bad air or infected clothing or contact with the sick. It was transmitted by a specific species of mosquito, Aedes aegypti. Reed proved it by controlled experiment. Volunteers allowed to be bitten by infected mosquitoes got yellow fever. Volunteers who slept in the clothing and bedding of yellow fever victims did not. The mechanism was clear. The mosquito was the vector. Gorgas used that knowledge to eliminate yellow fever from Havana in 1901. 0 cases in a city of 250,000 people within 90 days. He found the breeding sites, eliminated the standing water, screened the buildings. The mosquitoes couldn't breed. The disease couldn't spread. It worked completely. Roosevelt made him Chief Sanitation Officer of the Canal Zone. What Gorgas did in Panama between 1904 and 1906 was the largest public health campaign in history. Every structure in the zone was screened with wire mesh, every opening covered, every cistern sealed, every barrel of standing water oiled. A thin film of crude oil on the surface suffocates mosquito larvae before they can develop. Drainage ditches were dug around every building to prevent puddles. Fumigation brigades went building to building with sulfur and pyrethrum. The entire zone, building by building, was treated. The Isthmian Canal Commission thought Gorgas was wasting money. $1 million in the first year spent on mosquito control, not on digging. They tried to have him removed twice. They told Roosevelt that Gorgas was a fanatic chasing a theory that wasn't proven. Roosevelt kept him anyway. By 1906, yellow fever was gone from the Canal Zone. 0 cases. Not reduced, eliminated. Malaria dropped by 90% over the construction period. Workers got sick. Workers still died of disease. But not at the rates that had destroyed the French. The disease that had killed 20,000 workers over 23 years of French construction was brought to a manageable level in under 2 years. Here is the detail that gets left out of the monument inscriptions. The Panama Canal was won before the first steam shovel was positioned at Gaillard Cut. It was won by a doctor in khaki with oil sprayers and wire mesh going building to building through a jungle that the French had never been able to work in safely. Without Gorgas, the American construction phase looks like the French construction phase. Everyone who has ever driven across the canal bridge should know his name. Most do not. John Frank Stevens arrived as chief engineer in July 1905, and he understood something his predecessor hadn't grasped. The Panama Canal was not a construction problem. It was a railroad problem. Think about what moving 232 million cubic yards actually means. A cubic yard of rock weighs roughly 1.5 tons. That's 348 million tons of material that had to be excavated, loaded, transported, and dumped somewhere that wasn't where you were trying to dig. Every pound of it, every single pound. The excavation was the easy part. You drilled, you blasted, you loosened the rock. The hard part was getting it out. The French had equipment. They had Couvreux steam shovels, Belgian and Dutch and American machinery, but they couldn't move the material fast enough because their railroad logistics couldn't handle the volume. The shovel would fill a car. The car would sit because the track was blocked. The track was blocked because the dumping sites weren't cleared. The dumping sites weren't cleared because the switch schedules were wrong. The whole operation gridlocked, and the shovel sat idle in the bottom of the cut while men were dying 2 miles away and the company was going bankrupt. Stevens spent his first months in Panama not at the cut, but redesigning the railroad. Hundreds of miles of track constantly shifted as the excavation deepened, passing sidings every half mile so trains could move in both directions simultaneously. A grade system that let loaded cars go downhill to the dump sites using gravity. A schedule that kept every steam shovel fed with empty cars continuously so no shovel ever stopped waiting for transport. He built the logistics engine before he built anything else, because without it, the excavation was pointless. He also settled the design question that de Lesseps had gotten wrong. Sea level was impossible. The continental divide at Culebra peaked 300 feet above sea level. Cutting to sea level meant a gorge 300 feet deep and 9 miles long through rock and clay that was already demonstrating a fatal habit. When it got wet, which it did constantly, it moved. Entire hillsides liquefied and slid back into the cut. A sea level canal would require not just cutting through the mountain once, but cutting through the mountain perpetually, fighting gravity and geology simultaneously forever. Lock Canal. Raise the ships on the Atlantic side, 85 feet up to the level of the man-made lake that would fill the valley, cross the lake, come back down on the Pacific side. Dam the Chagres River, which had flooded catastrophically every rainy season and defeated the French engineering at every turn, and turn it into the largest man-made lake in the world. 3 locks rising, 3 locks descending. The continental divide crossed by water instead of cut to the bone. Stevens presented the plan. It was approved in June 1906. Congress authorized it. Construction began. In February 1907, Stevens resigned. His letter to Roosevelt said he was tired, that the burdens of the position were greater than is realized by those not in immediate touch with it, that he wanted to go back to railroad work in the United States. Roosevelt was furious. His response, by some accounts, called Stevens a quitter. He demanded an explanation. He never got a satisfying one. Stevens never gave a full public accounting of why he walked away from the most significant engineering project in American history when it was 7 years from completion. He went back to railroad engineering, lived to 90, gave a few interviews in his old age, none of which fully answered the question. The canal he designed was built by someone else. His replacement was George Washington Goethals, not an engineer in the civilian sense, an army colonel, corps of engineers, no canal experience. Roosevelt's instruction was simple: finish it, and unlike Wallace, unlike Stevens, don't quit. Goethals held Sunday morning courts. Any worker in the canal zone could walk in and present a complaint directly to him. No intermediaries, no bureaucracy. He'd hear the complaint, make a decision. That was the end of it. He knew that the only thing that killed morale faster than hard work was the feeling that nobody was listening. The Sunday courts kept him informed and kept the workforce functional. The problem Goethals inherited was Culebra, 9 miles through the Continental Divide, 9 miles of volcanic basalt, clay, shale, and decomposed rock that behaved differently depending on how wet it was, which varied by hour in Panama. The cut had to reach a minimum depth of 40 feet below water level to allow ships to pass. At the ridge, that meant excavating more than 300 feet down from the original surface. A gorge, a canyon, built by hand, by dynamite, by steam shovel, in a jungle. The clay was the defining challenge. Culebra clay, saturated with 300 inches of annual rainfall, was not a solid. It was a viscous mass that moved under its own weight. Crews would blast and shovel a slope clear. They would go home. It would rain, which it did for 7 months of the year, hard, daily, for hours. They would come back and the slope would have moved 10, 15, 20 feet downhill into the cut overnight, not collapsed, migrated, slowly, continuously, in volumes that overwhelmed the excavation. Some days the crews were removing less material than the hillsides were depositing. Some days they were running in place. At peak operation, 100 Bucyrus steam shovels were working the cuts simultaneously. Each one weighed 95 tons. Each one consumed 8 tons of coal per day. Each one operated in 3 shifts, around the clock, its dipper arm swinging every 30 seconds when the work was going well, loading 2 cubic yards of rock and mud per scoop. The noise at peak operation was continuous and total, described by workers who tried to describe it as something your brain eventually stopped processing individually and converted into a permanent background roar, like standing inside the sound itself. They fired dynamite in the cut 60 times a day on average. The blast schedules were synchronized so that after each detonation, the dust settled to a survivable level before workers were sent back in. Usually, there were premature detonations, there were misfires discovered too late, there were men who were in the wrong place when the mountain pushed back. In September 1913, a section of the west wall of the cut moved, not gradually, at once. 16 million cubic yards, the equivalent of 10 million dump trucks of material, slid into the bottom of the cut in a matter of hours. 2 weeks of excavation gone. The steam shovels working the west face got out, most of them. The crew assignments for that shift are in the canal zone records. The survival rate was better than it should have been. The warning signs had been visible enough that the foreman evacuated in time, but there had been other slides where the warning signs weren't visible enough. The cut was finished when Goethals ordered the Gamboa Dyke blown on October 10, 1913. The last earthen plug between Gatun Lake and the cut. President Wilson detonated it by telegraph from the White House. The water came in. Within days, the gorge was a channel. The steam shovels that hadn't been moved out in time were submerged. Some remain there today, under 40 feet of water in the Gaillard Cut, still sitting at the bottom of the excavation, where they stopped working. Here is the part of the story that the commemorative photographs leave out. At peak construction, roughly 56,000 people were working in the canal zone. Of those, approximately 5,500 were white Americans. Approximately 20,000 were West Indian. Black workers from Barbados, Jamaica, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Trinidad, and a dozen other islands who had come to Panama because the wages were better than anything available at home, and because the British colonial economies they came from had left them no other options. The rest were Spanish, Italian, Greek, and other immigrant workers from Europe and Central America. The West Indian workers were the backbone of the excavation. They ran the drill gangs that sank the blast holes. They worked at the bottom of the cut, closest to the face, shoveling the blasted rock into the shovel's range. They maintained the track that the material trains ran on. They worked as mechanics, as concrete pourers, as general labourers at every level and every phase. Without them, the canal doesn't get built. This is not a debatable point. There is no scenario given the available labour supply in which the canal gets built without the West Indian workers. The canal zone paid them less, housed them worse, fed them separately, and gave them a name for it. Gold roll and silver roll. White American workers were paid in US gold dollars. West Indian and other non-American workers were paid in Panamanian silver currency. The gold-silver distinction wasn't just about currency. It was a full segregation system administered by the United States government as official policy. Gold roll workers got screened housing, the better wire mesh, maintained regularly, in better locations. Silver roll workers got barracks, overcrowded, underscreened, in lower quality locations more exposed to mosquitoes, despite Gorgas's campaign. Gold roll workers ate at one set of commissaries with more variety and lower prices. Silver roll workers ate at separate ones. Gold roll workers used one set of post offices, laundry facilities, social clubs. Silver roll workers used different ones. Every facility in the canal zone was segregated, not informally, officially, by regulation, administered by the same US government that was, at this exact moment, presenting the canal project to the world as a triumph of American civilization. A gold roll carpenter earned $105 a month. A silver roll labourer earned 10 cents an hour. Do that math. 10 hours a day, 26 working days, $26 a month for the same heat, the same rain, the same dynamite going off overhead. They died at a higher rate than the gold roll workers. The reasons compound each other. They did more dangerous work in more dangerous positions. Their housing gave them worse protection from the mosquitoes that Gorgas hadn't fully eliminated. They had less access to the better medical facilities. When they were injured, they were less likely to be listed in the zone's official injury reports if they had already left the zone to seek treatment elsewhere. The official death count, 5,609, is based on the zone's hospital records and vital statistics office. A West Indian worker who was injured in the cut, helped to the nearest settlement by co-workers, died 3 weeks later in a boarding house in Panama City. That death is not in the 5,609. How far off is 5,609? The honest answer is nobody knows. The records that would tell us don't exist because nobody was required to keep them for the workers who mattered least. Conservative estimates of undercounting suggest the true American phase death toll is closer to 8,000 to 10,000. Add the French period, 20,000 to 22,000 by the estimates that do exist, and you are looking at somewhere between 28,000 and 30,000 deaths across the full history of building the canal. The range is wide because the records are bad. The records are bad because the workers whose deaths weren't counted were overwhelmingly silver roll workers. Were overwhelmingly black, a Barbadian expression from the construction period. Silver people built the canal. Silver people, meaning the silver roll workers. The ones who did the work, the ones who got less for doing it, the ones who were thanked by no one when it was finished. August 15th, 1914. The SS Ancon made the first official transit of the Panama Canal, a cement ship, unremarkable except for what it was crossing. 50 miles, 9 hours, 85 feet of elevation change on the way up, 85 feet back down. The Atlantic and the Pacific connected. Roosevelt, no longer president, said later that the canal was the most significant thing he'd ever done. He had visited during construction in 1906, the first sitting American president to leave United States territory while in office. He'd posed on one of the 95-ton Bucyrus steam shovels, coat and hat on, hands on the controls, and that's the photograph that went everywhere. A president at the controls. That image is what most people know about who built the Panama Canal. It was August 15th, 1914, 4 days after Britain declared war on Germany. The First World War was beginning. The world was not paying attention to Panama. Shipping companies were. Within a year, traffic through the canal was transforming global trade. Goods that had required 14,000-mile voyages now crossed in 50 miles. The cost of moving freight between the coasts of the United States dropped dramatically. Agricultural products from California reached the eastern United States at prices that made large-scale Western farming economically viable. Pacific Rim trade with Europe shortened by weeks. The military calculations that Roosevelt had made in 1903 played out exactly as he'd expected. Within 5 years, both the Atlantic and Pacific fleets could reach each other in days. The Panama Canal still operates. More than a century later, 14,000 ships a year, roughly $270 billion in cargo annually, about 5% of global trade. The original Gatun, Pedro Miguel and Miraflores locks are still working. The concrete poured between 1909 and 1913 has not failed. Over 111 years of salt water and tropical weather and the weight of 100,000 ship transits, it holds. The Gaillard Cut has been widened twice, expanded again between 2007 and 2016 as part of the Panama Canal expansion project that added a third, larger set of locks capable of handling the new generation of mega container ships. The new locks opened in June 2016. They were named for the expansion project, not for the workers who built the original canal. There is no monument in the canal zone to the West Indian workers. The silver roll system was abolished in 1955, 41 years after the canal opened. The United States finally acknowledged at that point that running official racial segregation in an American territory was incompatible with the civil rights arguments it was making in the Cold War. Better to integrate quietly after 4 decades than to have the argument used against American diplomacy. Panama gained full sovereignty over the canal on December 31, 1999. Midnight, an American official handed over the keys formally. The Panamanian government raised its flag over the Canal Administration Building. The workers who built it had been dead for 50 years. Their grandchildren were old. The Afro-Antillean Panamanians, descendants of the West Indian workers who came to dig and stayed because they had nowhere else to go, are still in Panama. Their great-grandparents came from Barbados and Jamaica on the promise of 10 cents an hour and housing that turned out to be substandard barracks. Panama didn't give them citizenship until 1941. They couldn't vote until 1946. They built a country's most important piece of infrastructure and spent 40 years afterward as residents without rights. In the country they'd helped create. The drill marks are still visible in the walls of the Gaillard Cut. Not obviously, you'd have to know what you're looking at, but they're there. The geometry of where the blast holes were drilled is still readable in the rock face. Each hole took hours to drill by hand, held by one man, hammered by 2 others in 300-inch-per-year rain, in a gorge that was collapsing as fast as they could clear it. There's an original Bucyrus steam shovel on display at the Miraflores Visitor Center. You can stand next to it and understand for the first time what it actually looked like when 100 of them were running simultaneously in a gorge 9 miles long and 300 feet deep. It's larger than you expect. Even knowing the numbers, it's larger than you expect. 50 miles. That's what they moved a mountain for. The dragon at Panama was 2 dragons simultaneously. Geology and disease. A continental spine 300 feet high and 9 miles of clay that moved like water when it rained, and a parasite delivered by a mosquito that nobody understood. And a jungle that had been killing people who tried to cross it for 400 years. They had to defeat all of it. Before the first lock chamber was poured, before the first steam shovel reached the cut face, they had to defeat the disease. Gorgas did that, with oil sprayers and wire mesh, going building to building. Goethals gets the monument, Roosevelt gets the photograph. Gorgas gets a footnote in most accounts. Stevens, the man whose logistics design made the excavation possible, is barely mentioned. The engineers whose names are on the locks, the dam, the cut, remembered more or less by people who know the history. The West Indian workers get a number, 5,609, the official death count which everyone who has looked carefully at the records believes is an undercount, possibly by a factor of 2. They get a silver roll paycheck that was worth less than a gold roll paycheck for the same hours in the same sun. They get separate post offices and separate commissaries and inferior housing, and the knowledge that when the canal opened, the celebrations in the canal zone were for the gold roll side of the fence. They moved 232 million cubic yards of rock and clay and volcanic mud. In a jungle. In heat that wrung the water out of you before you'd been underground an hour. With dynamite that went off when it was supposed to, and sometimes when it wasn't. With steam shovels that ran 24 hours a day, and with their hands when the shovels weren't enough, while a disease was trying to kill them that their housing didn't protect them from as well as it protected the people being paid more to do less. The canal is 50 miles long and has been open for 111 years, and the ships going through it today pass directly through the Gaillard Cut, directly through the rock that those drill gangs loosened with hand steels and powder charges, directly through the mountain that the French tried and failed to move for 23 years. The cut walls still have the marks in them. The original concrete hasn't cracked. The drainage ditches Gorgas ordered cut are still keeping the mosquitoes down. The names of the men who built it are on none of it. The canal doesn't need them. It just works. 14,000 ships a year, crossing 50 miles of water that shouldn't exist, over a mountain that everyone who looked at it said couldn't be moved. They made it move anyway.